You are a GP. You're also somebody who's creating content on social media and has grown a massive following. What led you onto this path?
I've always found mental health very interesting. It's generally quoted about 25 to 40% of what a GP does is mental health.
Are more people struggling with mental health now than 2 decades ago?
I think some things like ADHD, for instance, has increased, but that's probably just because there were loads of undiagnosed people before and we're playing catch up.
People have this theory that it's the rise of social media and our attention is being taken. Do you think there's truth in that?
I think our body's better designed to live in previous centuries when it comes to dealing with anxiety and threat. Smartphones and social media and just the pressures of the modern world have made anxiety much more prevalent. We might say of our children, I don't mind what they do as long as they're happy. But ultimately, happiness is an emotion. I remember reading something that Victoria Pendleton, she was being quite open about her mental health and said, actually, sometimes it's worse winning. And yet, I'm sure if you saw her after she won the gold medal, she'd have said, oh, I'm so happy.
What actually is burnout?
Burnout is
people who do genuinely have certain types of OCD are not seeking help.
They're just spam thoughts. Goodness, am I the sort of person that my baby? And then you think, what sort of person every time they see a knife thinks about their baby? I must be a monster.
Dr. Martin Brunet, thank you so much for being here. There is loads I want to speak about tonight. I'm going to dive straight in. The first thing that I do want to ask you is I'm just intrigued. You are a GP. You're also somebody who's creating content on social media and has grown a massive following around the subjects that you speak about, around mental health and so on. I'd just love to know a little bit before we dive into the stuff that's going to help us. Love to know a little bit more about you. Like, what led you onto this path that you're on now?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me, Matt. It's great to be with you. So I'm a GP, and I've been a GP 23 years in my practice, and I still work 3 days a week in the practice. And I think I've been asking myself this, why did I start talking about mental health? Because my channel's all about mental health. And I've always found mental health very interesting. I found it very rewarding talking to patients about their mental health. I'm very curious about people, and I think mental health is some of the most interesting parts of health. And as GPs, I think it's generally quoted about 25 to 40% of what a GP does is mental health, which is a lot more than most people think.
Wow. Mm.
But the other thing I've really enjoyed over the years is education. So I've done a lot of GP training. That's been my main sort of specialism, if you like, as a GP, is teaching the next generation of GPs. And I've realized probably only really in the last year or two that what's really made me enjoy doing this content is education, because there's a lot of education needed with mental health, trying to help people understand their mental health with what's going on. It can be very bewildering. And as a GP, I love doing that one-to-one with my patients, but I'm only doing it one at a time. And that's what made me motivated initially to start writing about mental health. I've been writing over the years. I've written a book on GP consultation and communication. That's all part of my GP training model background. And then I just thought, well, I'd like to do something not for the profession, but for the general public. So I started writing a book, which is actually coming out in March. It's called Your Worry Makes Sense. It's been a few years in the making. I've been very excited about it. And then I just started doing the posts on Instagram because, I thought it might help with the writing. Initially you think, well, maybe I need a social media presence, so that would be a good thing to help with the book. What I didn't expect was doing the posts on social media really helped change my thinking and develop my thinking about mental health, and actually has improved the writing as a result, I think.
Mm.
So that's sort of where the energy for it's come from. And yeah, it's been lovely to connect with lots of people on social media. All of a sudden, I'm not just one-to-one in my consulting room. I'm reaching people the other side of the world. It is quite extraordinary.
Absolutely amazing. I'm interested in the trends because obviously what you're saying there is you have been working now for over 2 decades. You're saying that over 40%, roughly, when you're working with people, generally is around mental health.
Mm.
And now, again, you've said through the platform of social media, that's informed a lot, and you've heard a lot of, different views, I imagine, from that, and it's changed the conversation a little bit. What are some of the trends? What is it for you you've noticed in terms of maybe are more people struggling with mental health now than 2 decades ago? And if so, is there specific things? What have you noticed?
I think, I mean, mental health's always been with humanity as long as we've been on this planet, I think. But I think it's definitely changing. And I think anxiety has really become much more common, much more difficult, or much more prevalent. We are better at talking about mental health, certainly, than we used to, and we're better at noticing things. So I think some things like ADHD, for instance, has increased, but that's probably just because there were loads of undiagnosed people before and we're playing catch up.
And do you think that is one of the main reasons? Because people have this theory that it's the rise of social media and this our attention is being taken. Do you think there's truth in that? What's your thoughts?
Um, I mean, I haven't looked at the research, so I'm only giving my own impression.
Yeah.
I think there might be a bit of that. I think there's raising awareness. What social media does is it raises awareness of things faster than the medical profession. When it came to medical things, it was the doctors that had ownership of that, and it was the medical profession that decided what messages to put out there. And now, it's much more democratic. Actually, anyone can put stuff out there. And I think that's a good thing. So lots of people are thinking, gosh, maybe I do have ADHD.
Mm.
Um, and, for many, they've been undiagnosed for many years. Now, there's obviously a danger that you might then start capturing people who don't actually have ADHD and overdiagnosing. That's always a danger. But I think there's just a backlog of undiagnosed people that will be diagnosed, and then the rates of new diagnoses will kind of level out as we, more just come to a steady state. Whereas I think anxiety is a bit different. We've always known about anxiety; it's always been there, but I think the modern world, and I do personally think smartphones and social media and just the pressures of the modern world have made anxiety, much more prevalent. It's difficult living in the 21st century, and I think our bodies were better designed to live in previous centuries when it comes to dealing with anxiety and threat, because the threat was the tribe next door that might attack you, or the threat of um, wild animals that might attack you. They were much more concrete and obvious, whereas the threats these days are, the threat of what if I haven't locked the door properly? Am I going to face going to the supermarket? I've got all this post arriving and I just can't cope with dealing with it. I'm swamped by emails. These are all threats and dangers and challenges that mankind didn't need to use to deal
Mm.
with.
Just
Um,
hearing you say that, it almost made me think of that phrase like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? And what I mean by that, so I know that might sound like a random kind of correlation, but that idea of like before things were just almost black and white, we're going back a long time ago, but it's just we're in a tribe, we've got to look after each other, we've got to hunt, find food, eat, sleep, look after, whatever. Whereas now what I'm taking from what you're saying there is there's all these little things almost like just bubbling beneath the surface, right? That are just, we're maybe not even fully conscious of just these little negative thoughts and worries and concerns
yeah.
all day, every day, right? So, in many ways, would you say that means life is just more an environment to create anxiety in human beings?
I think it's harder to navigate than it used to be. If you were in a village of only 20 people years and years ago, you never had to deal with the challenge of going into a crowded shopping centre with hundreds of people.
Yeah.
So, when it comes to social anxiety, for instance, that was, a totally different concept in a tiny village where you only, you knew everyone that you ever came into contact with. So I think there's a lot more to navigate. I think, it's very easy to just say, oh, there's an epidemic of anxiety among the young, and imply that it's a problem with that generation. I don't think that's true. I think Even my, my generation, we didn't have mobile phones. The generation of sort of my children, they had mobile phones just about, but they didn't have smartphones. Um, children and young people now have had to deal with smartphones often, from the age of 10, 11, even younger. That's a big challenge, and it's all happened at a real pace. So I don't think we should be surprised that anxiety is on the increase, and I think it genuinely is on the increase. Um, but also, we need to normalize anxiety. We all need a certain amount of anxiety. If we had zero anxiety, we'd probably all have fallen out of trees when we were young because we'd have climbed too high. When you're a child, you think, "Oh, this is exciting! I'll climb a tree." And you get to a certain point, and then your heart starts racing, and you feel anxious about going too any higher, and that stops you falling out of the tree because you've been stupid. So anxiety is there to save us from danger and keep us safe, and we need to welcome it for that. But the trouble in our modern world is very often it starts, especially if anxiety takes hold for you, it starts seeing threat where, at least on the surface, there isn't a threat. And I think that's one of the things that really motivated me to get writing and go onto the internet is that so many of my patients would say to me, "I know it's ridiculous, I know it's foolish," because it feels foolish to get anxious going to a supermarket. Or if, for instance, you've got into the habit of always checking that you've locked the door 3 times, it can feel ridiculous. Why do I need to do that? Other people don't need to do that. And on the surface, it seems foolish. And yet, if you dig a little deeper and understand anxiety, you can start to realize and learn that actually it makes perfect sense. That's why my book's called Your Worry Makes Sense, because actually, once you understand why your anxiety levels drop once you check it for the third time, then it makes perfect sense you're going to do that because what you're trying to do is just lower your anxiety in the moment. If you
Mm.
only check that you've locked the door twice, and you know that if you now leave the house, you're going to feel anxious and stressed because you didn't do it 3 times and you always do it 3 times. It makes a lot of sense to just do it that third time, and then you're going to have an easier journey. So actually, it's totally logical that you get into that. Um, but it's also highly problematic because now you're stuck with having to do it 3 times in order to reduce your anxiety and get yourself to work. So,
So let's delve a little deeper in that then, because I think
mm,
people listening that's interested. So what would you say, you referred to it there as it is problematic. What's
yeah,
the solutions if somebody's realized they've got these habits that are creating maybe more anxiety? The
yeah,
first step, what I'm hearing is understanding it a little bit more. And that's what you're saying there, you're going, okay, it makes sense. I understand why I do that. And I guess to some degree, you can have a bit more compassion and awareness, which is a pretty good first step. What would you say then is
isn't
some
it?
more advice around managing that and maybe not having to check the bloody door 3 or 4 times every day and things like that?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I say for some people, there will be deep trauma, deep issues, deep relationship issues, or toxic relationships. I mean, things that need to be sorted and looked at.
Sure.
They can really work on it. But
Yeah.
that aside, I think I think the first thing, to some extent, you've got to be annoyed, not at the anxiety. Very often people just get really annoyed with the anxiety. Oh, it drives me nuts. I hate the anxiety, and they struggle against the anxiety. Actually, I think the thing to get a little frustrated with is the restrictions the anxiety is putting on your life, if
Mm,
it is putting restrictions. So if if it's not putting a question I'll often ask my patients is, what does anxiety stop you doing? And if the answer is, well, nothing very important, then you don't need to do anything about it. Anxiety stops me going bungee jumping. I would never bungee jump, I'd be too terrified. But my life's pretty complete without bungee jumping. So it really doesn't matter that I don't do that. But if I'm getting frustrated that leaving the house because I've got little rituals I have to complete to manage my anxiety is taking too long, um, and causing me a problem, or if I'm frustrated that I can't go to the supermarket because I'm going to have a panic attack if I go there, then I've got the motivation to want to do something about it. And then the question is, okay, how do you do that? And ultimately, I like to see sort of 3 zones in our life. You've got your comfort zone, things you can do unrestricted. You've then got an expansion zone around that. which are areas that you want to be able to do, but at the moment you can't because anxiety stops you. And then beyond that, you've got a no-go zone, areas that you don't need to do at all. So, bungee jumping is in my no-go zone. Um, Interestingly, doing this sort of talking in front of people, teaching, I'd happily stand up and teach to a huge crowded room of people, but so that's in my comfort zone. But acting on a stage is in my no-go zone.
Yeah.
I get very anxious and stressed about it, but actually I don't really want to do it.
Yeah.
So you need to work out, okay, what's in my expansion zone that I need to work on? And then how am I going to do that? Definitely you're going to do it in very small steps. And you're going to have to think, what am I going to do with the anxiety in the meantime? Because there's two main approaches to anxiety that will be instinctive, both of which again are a bit problematic. So, and they're obey and struggle. This, if anyone's interested in the theory behind this, look up acceptance and commitment therapy. It's a type of therapy. It's really interesting, actually. A psychologist messaged me on Instagram and said, "Are you ACT or ACT trained?" And I went, "ACT? What's that?" Because I'd never really heard of it before. But actually, instinctively, so much about ACT or ACT really appeals to me that I was just, you know, getting things that made sense. As a teacher and a GP, just if it makes sense to me, I'll, try it out with patients and see what happens. But with ACT, it often talks about these two states, struggle and obey. So obey is where you just do the thing, check the door 3 times, avoid supermarkets. And often people will use language like, I have no choice. I can't do anything else. I can't go to supermarkets. I have to lock the door 3 times. Those would be it's often very black and white. There's not a lot of wiggle room with those phrases. And which is really understandable because it feels like you have to obey this. The other possibility that you do is you struggle against it. So you're always trying to fight the anxiety. You get really frustrated and cross and angry that you have to check it 3 times. But the effect of that is it just makes you more stimulated when you're struggling and fighting. And actually, you're so stimulated anyway because you're anxious. And the more stimulated you are, the more difficult it is to manage the anxiety.
I guess exhausting as well, right? It's just a
Yeah.
lot of energy.
Yeah, very much so. And it's really interesting. In fact, I was talking to someone who said to me, um, they had this ritual of checking the door when leaving the house, and they said to me, the really frustrating thing is when I'm late, you'd think I'd decide, well, I don't need to do it, but actually, when they were late, it made them more stressed. Their heart was going faster. Therefore, they felt more anxious because when your heart races, your body thinks, I must be anxious, there must be stress. Um, and therefore, they had a greater need to check. So the later they were, the more checking they had to do because they had more anxiety to bring down.
Wow.
Um, so struggling against our anxiety generally doesn't work very well, and obeying just leaves us trapped. So what's the alternative? And the alternative is in the line acceptance and commitment therapy. It's very often to accept the anxiety and tolerate the symptoms you're getting. And sometimes even to think it, quite a nice trick is to say to your anxiety, thank you for trying to keep me safe. So for instance, say you're trying to go from checking the door 3 times to checking the door twice. When you've done it twice and you feel your anxiety, you might be able to say to your anxiety, okay, thank you for trying to keep me safe and helping down my anxiety. I see you, and I recognize that you're making my heart race a little bit at the moment. But actually, for the moment, I'm just going to let you be there, tolerate you, but I'm not going to obey you. I'm not going to struggle against you. I'm going to stay calm. And actually, I'm just going to check twice today. And I'm going to tolerate the fact that my heart is going a bit fast. But I know that's just my heart responding to adrenaline. I tolerate the fact that my guts are churning. But I know that's just the effect of stress and anxiety. And I'm going to focus on my breathing because I can control that. And that will slow me down a little bit. And that's how I'm going to manage my anxiety. And then I won't have to obey you quite as much, but I've taken a baby step.
I think what's interesting as well for anybody listed to pick up on there is that what you're saying ultimately is it's about becoming more conscious in the moment. I
Mhm.
guess what a lot of us do is just create patterns that we just play out almost unconsciously, and we just play out this anxiety and we just do what we do, whether it be the obey, like you say, whether it be the fight and the challenge in it. The first thing that I'm hearing there is really become more conscious in the moment and then break that pattern, interrupt that pattern, talk to the anxiety, maybe even thank it, like you're saying. I've heard you speak about as well. Imagine it's a monster, your anxiety is a monster. Do you want to just share a little bit about that as
Yeah,
well?
yeah. So it is it's trying to create this separation from the anxiety. And one trick, and so one of the chapters in my book is about the anxiety monster. And so it's actually seeing your anxiety as a monster. But I really like the power of silliness. Um, because if you can imagine that monster in a silly way, so maybe actually it's got slightly goofy teeth. It's, it's got eyes on stalks, but they look a bit silly. It's a funny color. Maybe you give it a name. In my book, I call it Wilbur. No offense to anyone called Wilbur, but I don't know anyone called Wilbur personally. So Wilbur would work for me because if I call my anxiety Wilbur, I'm not thinking of anyone else. So
Yeah.
then you might go, oh, yeah, Wilbur, you're with me. You know, you're telling me there's a threat on the way to the supermarket because you really don't like going to supermarkets, do you, Wilbur? But we're going to go today. I'm going to keep you with me, put you in my pocket, and actually we will manage it. We'll manage it together. Um, and you can even make a little monster, of felt or get creative, make it, and then you can visualize it. Because what you're then doing is you're associating totally different emotions, the emotions of silliness and humor, with that anxiety. Whereas when you're struggling against it, your emotions are sort of anger and frustration. And when you're obeying it, they're just sort of learned helplessness.
Mm.
But now you're taking a little bit of control and you're perhaps having a little laugh, a gentle, kind laugh at yourself, rather than a frustrated, beat yourself
Mm.
up. Um, you
I
know,
think that's an important thing to recognize because what we're saying ultimately, anxiety is a feeling, it's an emotion. And what you're
yeah,
saying is it's about now replacing that with, like you said, the feeling of being a bit more in control, the feeling of having fun. I mean, I've spoke about something similar. I'm way less articulate than you, Martin, and I will
yeah,
swear, and I don't know if you encourage that or not, but I would say something like, "Oh, here you are, you bastard! You're here again," and that makes me laugh. I'm thinking I'm
yeah.
talking to my imaginary anxiety and calling it a bastard. Like, do you know? But that's kind of what you're saying, right?
I think the key thing is if for you swearing makes you smile,
Yeah,
that's great.
yeah.
You
I've got a
know,
potty mouth, so that's me.
yeah. If swearing isn't what you normally do, or you only ever swear when you've hit your thumb or you're really frustrated, then swearing is associated with angry
Yeah,
emotions. Probably
pain.
won't.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, something that makes you smile can be very powerful in this situation. Yeah.
I love that. I've seen you do some content as well where you were talking about and raising the question, really, I guess, about why do we label people as disordered when we're talking about mental health? And, with this exact topic here, we hear about anxiety disorder and things like
Yeah.
that. And you read out sort of a definition that we can find of what disorder means. And I made a note of it here. You said it means lack of order, confusion, tumult, riot,
Yeah.
and commotion. And like immediately that feels like, hang on, that's not a positive thing. So
Yeah.
is there something wrong? And I know you said as well that we would never say that about a physical health problem, if we had a physical pain or a problem. I'm just interested in that in terms of what your thoughts are on is giving people labels like disorder. Is it useful? Is it problematic? What's your overall take on it?
Yeah, I think it is problematic. And what's really interesting in medicine is as a doctor, you just learn these terms. So you don't really think
Mm.
about it initially. Um, and actually, I went to a conference at Lambeth Palace once, and the Archbishop of Canterbury was talking to someone who had bipolar. And the Archbishop of Canterbury's been very open about his own depression over the years. And that was the first time I heard someone say, I really don't like the term disorder. It was in this conversation he had. And it just made me think, yeah, you're right. It is problematic because, if with mental health's hard enough, but if you then add, ideas of sort of blame or shame or stigma on top, it just makes it harder still. Now, I basically the diagnostic labels, most of them come from a huge manual called the DSM, which is an American manual of mental health diagnostic terms. And we're kind of a bit stuck with them in a sense. You and I can't change this overnight. But it's the manual, it's sort of the disorders of mental health manual. So that's the pattern they've got into, which is a real shame because, yeah, we don't say the same for physical problems. So I think sometimes we can just avoid using the term, generalized anxiety disorder. I just say generalized anxiety, or, bipolar affective disorder. Maybe we can just call it bipolar. But I think at least if we can recognize that it's not a helpful term because disorder has a lot of negative connotations. And I'm really interested in language and how different words can affect how you feel about something. So,
Mm.
for instance, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. If you think of someone with ADHD from a doctor's perspective, if I'm talking to you and you've got ADHD, it seems to me like you have a deficit of attention because you're not focusing on me, because you're noticing everything else. But actually, to you, you probably feel like you've got an excess of attention. Everything wants your attention. It's like attention overload for you. It's not a deficit.
Hmm.
Uh, and unfortunately, doctors quite often label things. Historically, we've labeled things from our perspective. And it would be great if we could do it a bit more the other way around.
Yeah,
So,
I completely agree. And I think this is such a great conversation to have because, like you said, these things aren't going to change overnight, but
mm,
it is questioning and challenging the norm. And it's challenging what we've had for so long that then is the beginning of change, right? And I also want to speak about a lot of this show is about helping people live happier, healthier, more fulfilling lives. And I talk a lot about fulfillment being important. Um, and I know you've spoke again about the happiness trap and how
mm,
maybe focusing on and aiming to be happy all the time
yeah.
isn't wise. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, part of this is, that term, the happiness trap, I have to acknowledge where it comes from. It's from a book by Russ Harris, who um, it's called The Happiness Trap. And he's a proponent of ACT therapy, used to be a GP, so he must be a good chap. Uh, and yeah, I think definitely we often think, and, this is the Success School podcast, and I know later you're going to ask me what do I think is the sign of success.
Don't give it away. That's a spoiler. Nobody expects that.
Oh, because they never listened to your podcast.
Yeah, I've never said, yeah, exactly.
um, we'll come to that later, but it's
Yes.
definitely not happiness. It's very easy to say it's happiness, and we might say of our children, "I don't mind what they do as long as they're happy," or we
Mm,
might say, "Well, do whatever makes you happy." But ultimately, happiness is an emotion. It's a temporary state of being. There are times when I feel very happy, and there are other times, and that's nice. I love feeling happy. It's a nice feeling. But, there are times when I just feel tired, or I feel a bit stressed, or I feel a bit anxious, or just a bit down. There are times in my life, as with all of ours, where we're going through something very sad, a bereavement, where actually it's actually right to be sad. If you're surrounded by social injustice, or, imagine, thankfully, we're not growing up in a war zone, but if you were, are you going to be happy? So if we define success as being happy or feeling happy all the time, then, like you say, we're really setting people up to fail. And a lot of the markers of success, like, you know, like earning enough money or being, you know, having more followers on Instagram, these sorts of things, they, they do make you happy for a little while, and then you go back to normal. Um,
Mm.
I remember reading something that Victoria Pendleton, who was one of Britain's best sprint female cyclists, won loads of gold medals, and has been quite open about her mental health and said actually sometimes it's worse winning because you then just have this total anticlimax, And yet, I'm
Mm.
sure if you saw her after she won the gold medal, she'd have said, "Oh, I'm so happy."
Mm.
But a few days later, she crashed
Mm.
because it's not, we don't always stay in a state of happiness. Mood goes up and down in a normal way. And there's something deeper, which we'll come to later when I try and answer your question that, of course, none of us knew you were going to ask at the end.
All right, I love it. The suspense is killing me. I'm going to talk extra fast because I want to hear more on that. But let's come back to the book. So, just to be clear, the book is called Your Worry Makes Sense. And it says there anxiety and burnout are logical and you can overcome them. One of the chapter titles that stood out to me when I was just having a little look through is chapter 8. It says health anxiety. And it
Yeah,
said there a particularly tricky beast.
yeah.
Health anxiety. What would you say that is, and why is it a particularly tricky beast?
I think so. Health anxiety is where you worry about your health. So you get a symptom, oh, I've got chest pain, and your mind just escalates or catastrophizes down. I think I'm having a heart attack, or you find a small lump and you obsess about thinking, goodness, that could well be cancer. And I think one thing that makes it really tricky is the the sort of potential vicious circle between your feelings and your worries and what's going on in your body. Because when we're anxious, it changes our physiology. If you're anxious, your heart starts to go a bit faster. You start to, maybe be a bit shaky, a bit trembly. You might start breathing faster. If you breathe a bit too fast, then you can go quite lightheaded. You might get tingling in your fingers and your toes. Now, if you're anxious about, just anxious, if say you're anxious about going to a supermarket, then those symptoms are hard enough as it is. But if the thing that made you feel anxious was what's going on with your body, then the anxiety itself creates more symptoms in your body, which is then more for you to worry about.
Mm.
So, it becomes easily goes into a vicious cycle where the more you worry, the more symptoms you get. And the more you notice your body. Generally, we kind of have a filter in our brain that tells us which symptoms to notice and which not to. So right now, I've got a little pain in my right leg because I've got my legs crossed and it's giving me a bit of discomfort. I've got a slight itch here, goodness knows why. I've got a slight tinnitus ringing in my ears because I often do. But my brain is just filtering out those symptoms. It's ignoring them, saying they're not important. But there needs to be a level at which the itch becomes, gosh, I better check that because that might be an insect biting me. The pain gets to a point where I think, oh, I need to do something about that, or at least I need to uncross my legs because my legs are hurting, and now that stopped hurting. Or actually, I think I'm really sick. I need to go and see a doctor. And when you have health anxiety, it's like that filter's broken. And
Mm.
so you start noticing all sorts of symptoms in your body that normally you would just filter out. And then you start worrying about them. And then you can get stuck on Googling the symptoms, which never ends well if you have health anxiety, because you always end up, I often say, you're always 6 clicks from cancer. If you Google any symptom, within about 6 clicks, you'll end up
Yeah.
on cancer, before you know
I
it.
bet 6 is at
So
the extreme as well. I
it
bet you can get
probably
there
is.
easily in one
Yeah.
or two. What about I think with people that's common. I assume for some people they'll have evidence to support that
Mm.
catastrophizing almost,
Yeah.
i.e., maybe they've had the loss of a loved one at a young age or they've experienced something firsthand. So if somebody can acknowledge and identify that they do always, presume it's cancer and it's the worst, but they've also got all this stacked up evidence to say, well, it could be, what sort of some solutions to help them maybe just rationalize things better?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's good to recognize where it may come from because it might have come from one particularly traumatic health scare. It might have been a learned behavior from someone in your family. Might even be everyone else in your family is blasé about their health, and so you feel like you've got to worry for everyone. Then the hold on, I've lost my train of thought. There was there was where's it's come from? You said something else.
Just
Um,
about if somebody has maybe lost a loved one
oh,
and
the stacked evidence. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So I want to talk about confirmation bias. So very often what happens is a thing called confirmation bias, which is where you believe something, and so therefore you either notice evidence that supports that a lot more, or you put a lot more weight on it. So if you have health anxiety, for instance, a lot of people, when King Charles announced that he had cancer, that had health anxiety, it kind of sent their health anxiety into a spin because, all of a sudden, yet more proof that people get cancer. And yet, logically, we all know that, you know, getting cancer is not that uncommon as people get a lot older. And so some famous people are going to get cancer. But what that person hasn't noticed is that, oh, well, Camilla doesn't have cancer. And actually, Queen Elizabeth didn't have cancer and lived to be well into her 90s. And they ignore all
Mm.
the negative evidence and just go with the positive evidence. So even people who have got quite a lot of evidence in their family, actually it's usually this confirmation bias that's the problem. So, for instance, someone who comes from a family where they really have a high incidence of cancer, maybe because they've got one of the cancer genes, um, I don't associate them as being health anxious. They're no more likely to have health anxiety than someone else. It's not really the evidence that causes you to have anxiety. It's how you interpret and feel about the evidence. And it's more that whenever someone has a health scare, that creates an awful feeling in you, which makes the health anxiety have more power, rather than you doing a scientific study and coming to the logical conclusion that, you're bound to fall ill soon because of all this evidence. So it's more about how we feel about it than the actual evidence.
And I guess it's about, again, a theme that I'm hearing is it's about bringing that to your awareness. Like, how are you interpreting the evidence, not the evidence itself, perhaps? And that's about a lot of what we talk about on this show, which is about working on self awareness. And that's going to help you make more informed choices that are going to serve you better. Obviously, a big part of the book is also about the subject of burnout. I'd
Yeah,
love to just hear a little bit about your thoughts on that in terms of what actually is burnout.
yeah,
Why do we get it? Who is likely to get it? And
yeah,
importantly, how can we manage it?
yeah. So burnout burnout fascinates me because a bit like anxiety, when people come and say, I know it's foolish, when people have burnt out, they will come to me and they'll say, I don't know why this has happened. And they'll often say, I'm not the sort of person to get burnt out. And within 5 minutes of knowing them and might be meeting them for the first time, within 5 minutes, I'm thinking, you're exactly the sort of but they don't realize it because we have. So to come to say, well, what is burnout? Burnout is when you're overwhelmed, when you've just had too much stress for too long, and the continual pounding has led to a break. I like to relate it to a stress fracture. So if you go on a 50-mile march, you might break your foot. And it's not because you fell over, it's because the continual pounding has caused a stress fracture, and now you can't even walk. So someone with burnout, it's the continual pounding. It might be work pressures, it might be emails, it might be caring pressures as being a carer who's constantly looking after everyone. And that continual pounding means that suddenly something's broken and you just can't function anymore. And maybe sometimes it leads to depressive type symptoms, you're just completely flat and low and lost motivation to do anything. Quite often it's more anxiety, you have a panic attack, you just end up in bits and you can't function. And quite often, quite physical symptoms. It's like your body just collapses and your energy just disappears. And it's your body just saying, look, this can't carry on. You've got to stop. So, who is it that gets that? Well, people often imagine that it's weak people that burn out. The reason why you burnt out was because you couldn't take it. And and that's the myth about it, and it's completely wrong. You know, if there isn't even if there even is someone that you might describe as weak, they're not necessarily they're not likely to burn out because they're not going to take on that much. They're not going to take on the pressures. So the people that do take on enough pressure to actually burn out are generally very strong, capable people. They
Which is
tend
why they
to
say, "Oh, I'm not the sort of person," because they've got this belief that I'm strong, I'm tough, I do, and they just think, that doesn't happen to me, right?
exactly, exactly, and they're the sort of people where when the going gets tough, they just pedal harder.
Mm.
So they often set high standards. They may not be very good at delegating because either because they don't like dumping on other people, they feel bad about that, or because they so set high standards that they think, well, if the only way to get it right is if I do it. So they worry about it not being done properly if they delegate it. Uh, they'll generally just accept more work when it's given because they're not very good at saying no. They're sometimes at the hub of the family. Everyone's always turning to them for help. They might also be a little bit vulnerable to criticism, particularly self-criticism. And that's the sort of person that burns out. Now they're great people to have at work or in your family because they're highly competent. They care about what they're doing. You meet a lot of people like this in caring professions because they've gone into that because they care and they're passionate about it. Meet a lot of people like that in the church. Again, they've got great motivation to want to help and run everything and do everything. So they're really good people. That's who they are. And if they don't sort of spot the warning signs that they're starting to feel overwhelmed, and quite often you're if you're heading towards burnout, you might well have some warning signs where either maybe you're starting to get some bodily symptoms, or sometimes you just think, well, I could just do that then and do that then, and okay, if I can get to the weekend, but actually the weekend's going to be quite busy, but it's all right. And you're starting to think like that because you don't have any breathing space. This feeling of I just don't have anywhere to breathe. Um, that's kind of what it feels like. And the question is, can you pick that up and decompress a bit before you fall over the edge? Because when you do fall over the edge, it's like falling off a cliff.
Okay, so I just heard that. I went, okay, that's exactly how my week feels and has felt for weeks and weeks and weeks. I mean, I tell a lie, I did go on holiday, but it's a common way that I live my life.
Mm.
So speaking specifically to somebody in that boat, if they hear that as I just have a go, okay, I'm maybe on the path to burnout here.
Yeah.
Like I've noticed the symptom. What would you say is an immediate way to start solving it before it's too late, kind of thing?
So I think it's about trying to make your average week sustainable. So, you know, if if the only way you decompress is with a holiday and then you go straight back to everything being too much, then it won't really last.
Yeah, that's exactly
Well,
what I did, by the way.
so so if I look at my week, for instance, I do 3 long days in the surgery. They're 12, 13 hour days, are pretty intense. I'm pretty worn out by the end of them. But then I do have 2 days in the week when I'm not in the practice. Now, quite often for half of one of those days, I'm logged on at home, clearing up the debris, as I call it.
Mm.
But then I have got some space to either relax or do writing or teaching or other things. And that pattern, as long as I don't feel those 2 days too much, which sometimes I do, that pattern sustains me so that I might be really tired at the end of one day, but actually the next day I'm good to go.
So it's
And
about finding that weekly pattern that works for you as an individual, really. Is that right?
yeah, I think so. And also being aware of what burdens you and what energizes you. So,
Mm.
there's nothing wrong with stress. Some stress is great and actually, quite exciting. I was looking forward to doing this tonight because it's a little bit stressful, a bit nerve-wracking, people watching. What am I going to say? But actually, it's a stress that buzzes me. And yet there
Mm.
are some other stresses that just are a burden that
Yeah,
nag away at you.
yeah.
And one thing I quite like, and the book has got some fabulous illustrations by an illustrator called Hannah Robinson, and she's done a beautiful drawing of this where someone's packed their car, the boot of their car, and it's just too full. You know, when you're going on holiday and you pack the boot, and everything is it's like it's all stacked in exactly. Everything's got its exact shape that it fits in because you're trying to cram as much as you can into the boot, which is fine until you think, oh goodness, I need the sun cream, and it's down the bottom somewhere, and then you have to unpack the whole thing to get the sun cream. Whereas if when you pack your boot's only 70% full and you think, oh, I need the sun cream, you can just open the boot, rummage around, get the sun cream in your way. So it's a bit like that with our lives. If we've we don't have we don't want to have an empty boot. In other words, we don't want to have no stress because stress is what motivates us, gets us up, gives us purpose in life. Um, but if you're kind of 70, 80% full, you've got that wiggle room, you've got the places where you decompress. You're not trying to think, how do I fit that in and cram it in? And if you need your metaphorical sun cream from your boot, you can get it. Whereas if you cram it in the whole time, then even minor things can overwhelm you, and you can just, a little thing, and all of a sudden it feels like the world's ending because everything's too
Mm.
jammed in. So make sure there's some space.
For your sun cream, basically.
Yeah.
Or yeah. No, I love that. And so I hear that as being like a really good thing we can all do is just recognize, are we more than 70% full ultimately? And
Mm.
if so, where can we make adjustments? I imagine one big piece will be saying no to things and being okay with not having to take on everything and say yes to everyone. And I guess attached to that is setting boundaries, which again, I know is a common theme that people really struggle with. I also recognized in your book there was a chapter called Burnout Recovery, and it said there, discover the right side of your brain. I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit
Yeah.
more about that. I'm assuming that's when somebody has, really severely dealt with burnout. It's now how to move beyond that, right?
Yes. Yeah, it is. It's also something though to practice generally. So
Okay.
sometimes if you've actually burnt out, then on the one hand, the outlook is good. You know, I would be very optimistic that someone will be able to make a good recovery, but it will probably take longer than they think. They might well be out of action for 3, 6 months as they're recovering and rebuilding. So, you might have to expect that. But then the question is, what are you going to do in that time? Say, particularly if you've been signed off work. It's harder if you're a carer because children and relatives you care for don't take sick notes. Um, but but if you've been signed off work, it can be tricky to know what to do because if you've broken your leg, you know what to do. You walk around on crutches. If you've got flu, you take yourself to bed and take paracetamol. What do you do when you're burnt out and you look fine, but you don't feel it? Well, the worst thing you can do is just hide away at home and do nothing because that's not going to help you recover. So you'll need to go out and start doing things, and you'll need to cope with the fact that you might meet a work colleague who just thinks, all very well for them, they're going for a nice walk, but actually that's part of your rehab.
Mm.
So you need to find, some physical things to do, but particularly getting to the right side of your brain. This I read a book. I quite enjoy doing drawing and painting, and there's a great book about drawing with the right side of your brain, and it talks about how the left side of our brain is very impatient. It's very word based, and if you try and draw someone's face with the left side of your brain, generally the left side of your brain just tells you, well, you know how a face looks, you know how an eye looks, just draw it, get on and do it. Um, and generally it looks terrible. Whereas the right side of your brain will more it's more interested in just abstract, in shapes and lines. And so if you're drawing with the right side of your brain, you just think you wouldn't be thinking of drawing an eye, you just go, oh, the upper lid curves like that, and then it comes around like that, and the pupil is a funny shape, isn't it? And you just think about shapes and textures and the like. So it makes you a better artist. But what I really love about it is when you're in left side, you're impatient, your brain's in full flow, and it's quite stressy. If you get into a right-sided brain activity, it generally gets lost in it. So, if you're really drawing freely like that as an artist, then you lose track of time, you lose track of what's going on around you, and you don't really concentrate on anything else. So I just encourage people to think, find an activity that helps you just get lost in it.
Mm.
And whatever that is, it's almost certainly going to do you good. And it'll be different for different people because, one of my GP colleagues, she loves running outdoors. She goes for a run. She could hardly tell you where she went. She wouldn't be able to tell you anything about what was going on in her head. If you told her, can you solve this problem while you go on the run? She might try, but she'd forget it because she'd just be absorbed in the run. Send me on a run and I get quite bored. My brain starts thinking about all sorts of things because I
Mm.
just don't really enjoy the run. Send me into the garden. I can't think about anything other than weed this, pull that out,
Yeah.
chop that back. And I lose my tools because I lose track of what I'm doing. I'll go out to do one job and forget what job I was doing, end up doing another one. I'm in my right side of my brain and it does me so much good.
I
So
love that. Just hearing you say it, it almost just makes me think it's about reconnecting with being human. I feel like a lot of what you're saying about the left side of the brain, it's about what society has told us, which is we need to achieve goals, tick boxes, get this done, do that. And actually what I'm hearing is it's just like just connect with feeling, creativity, emotion, getting lost. And I think a lot of us need to do a lot more of that. I clearly have done it because I'm losing track of the time completely. So you've helped me get it tap into right side of the brain, right here, and I'm aware I want to be mindful of the time and make time for our members' questions as well. However, there is a couple of things that I want to ask really fast because some really important stuff that we've not touched upon that I'd love to get
yeah,
in before we finish up, and one of them in particular relates to our community manager Helen. Now she knows I'm going to ask this. By the way, she we spoke about this previously, but one of the things that Martin you came on to be on Helen's radar for, and I believe she's followed you for quite a while, is because of the fact that you speak a lot about OCD, and that is something that affects Helen. And it's something that she has recognized that not many people do speak about it in terms of breaking down stigmas and helping people understand what it actually is. And from the conversations Helen and I have had, a lot of people, and admittedly, this was absolutely myself if it wasn't for Helen, they just have this misconception that OCD is just people who just like to be clean and wash their hands all the time and be tidy all the time.
yeah,
And what Helen has explained to me has completely opened my mind. And I realize so many of us have got it so wrong. And importantly, people who do genuinely have certain types of OCD are not seeking help because they think, oh my God, I could never share this. I could never tell people the thoughts that go through my mind. So I'm just going to keep it to myself. Could
yeah.
you just maybe touch on that for a couple of minutes, Martin, just about breaking down the stigmas and helping people be aware of what it really is?
Yeah. So I think firstly, OCD is not helped by people saying, "Oh, I'm a bit OCD," when they just mean they like things tidy.
Yeah.
And there are types of OCD that's all about order and symmetry, but often it involves doing a lot of counting and checking and struggling if numbers aren't even or in a pattern, and it creates a lot of anxiety. So there is truth that OCD sometimes is about order, and there's truth that OCD sometimes is about cleanliness and contamination. But there are also some really unspoken types of OCD, particularly around intrusive thoughts. Um, and and OCD can be tremendously lonely. So the intrusive thoughts are when thoughts pop into your head and they terrify you. And then you become obsessed with worrying about them. And in particular, there's a form of OCD that's sometimes called harm OCD. It's sometimes also called pure O. Well, that's not really an accepted term. And what sometimes happens is this thought pops in your head of, gosh, what if I could harm someone? It's particularly common postnatally. You've got this tiny little vulnerable bundle that you're suddenly trusted with, and you just the awful thought pops into your head. What if I'm the sort of parent who just deliberately drops my baby on the floor? Or there's a knife. What if am I the sort of person that could stab my baby. Horrific thoughts, really awful thoughts. And what's key is they're just spam thoughts. They're just random thoughts pop into your head. But because they're so horrifying, you don't just hit the delete file or stick them in the recycling like we should with spam. You start worrying about it. And once you start worrying about it, then you can get into patterns of thinking, well, goodness, every time you see a knife, you start worrying about it because it reminds you of, goodness, am I the sort of person that might stab my baby? And then you think, what sort of person every time they sees a knife thinks about stabbing their baby? I must be a monster. I must be awful. And then it's a very hard thing to tell anyone about because if you don't know about this, you're going to just think, you what? What are you thinking? It sounds terrifying and scary. You might be really worried about telling a health professional because you'll be thinking they'll phone social services because they think I'm going to harm my baby. Actually, this the key thing here is you're so appalled and shocked by it that you're exactly totally not the person that would do this. Um, so, a health professional that knows about it will immediately spot this and just say, well, look, this is intrusive thoughts. It's harm OCD. Have you ever heard of it? But it's very, very lonely because many people don't tell anyone for years. And I did a post about harm OCD, and in the comments, some were just heartbreaking. Someone who said, I had this for 10 years after my child was born, and I thought I was a monster.
Oh man.
And if only I knew now what knew then what I know now.
Wow. I just think that's, and thank you so much for raising awareness to that because I'm sure there's a lot of people that would have never even known that. And I just want to use this as an opportunity to highlight it and say if anybody's listening to that right now and identifies with that and they think, oh my God, like I have thought I'm a monster. I think there's something that you said that if you do have OCD, you're the exact opposite. The fact that you're so appalled at yourself
Yeah.
tells you you're not the person that would ever do something like that. And there is help out there. It is a normal thing. It does affect people. Get help, right? Go and speak to your GP.
Yeah, and if you're worried about seeing your GP, go and speak to your GP and say, I think I'm getting intrusive thoughts. Start that way. Use the term intrusive thoughts because I think that's what's key to it. And it's not only a postnatal thing. There are cases of, a teacher, particularly a male teacher, who suddenly has this, what if I'm a paedophile terror? And they're not. They're absolutely not. They're not tempted in any way, but then they start obsessing about it. Or sometimes people have the, what if I'm the sort of person that might kill myself? And it's totally different to someone who's actually suicidal and is thinking, gosh, it would be a relief not to wake up tomorrow, which is actually far more common. But you can start finding yourself thinking every time you see a rape, what if I'm the sort of person that might hang myself?
Mm.
When actually, you want to be alive, it's not tempting at all. So it's a very different flavor. And absolutely, it's good to talk about it, particularly to healthcare professionals or, go online and follow. There's some great OCD channels actually on Instagram and social media, and maybe follow them, try and learn a bit about it, become a bit of an expert. And I'd also say, if you're someone who cares about someone else who has OCD or has anxiety, it can seem ridiculous to you. You might think, how can you think that? You're not a monster. Don't use normal logic to understand it. Go and learn about it first and learn that actually just telling someone, no, you're not a monster, don't be so ridiculous, is really not very helpful. But there are other ways that you can help someone if you go and learn about what OCD is really about, and then you can help them make progress.
Dr. Martin Brunet, this has been amazing. We've covered so much ground, and we're going to now, as I say, head into the Q&A with the members. Just before we do, I've got some quick fire general questions that I ask all
Yeah.
my guests, and then we're going to finally complete the cliffhanger and find out a little bit more about that question nobody expected. So, final few questions.
Yeah.
This is more about you and your personal experiences. So the first one is, what is some of the best advice that you have had in your life that you live by and why?
So one of the best pieces of advice actually came from a lovely doctor called Chris Jagger. He was a senior partner in my practice, retired about 13 years ago. And he was talking about bereavement. And he said, if you can allow yourself to both laugh and cry, give yourself permission to do them both, you're probably on the right track.
Mm.
And that's advice I give to my patients all the time. And I always think of Chris when I give that advice because many patients won't either allow themselves to cry because they have to be strong, or they won't allow themselves to laugh because it feels like a betrayal of the person that they're missing. If you can do both. So I say that to my patients, and when I've been bereaved, it's definitely something I hold on to.
Wow, that's amazing. And it also made me think that there's something similar there about if you can allow yourself to work hard and be focused and productive and also guilt-free, switch off completely.
Yeah,
And it just there's a similarity there with something else I think a lot of people struggle with, which is like if they're not working or
yeah,
doing something for others or being productive,
yeah.
they feel like they should feel guilty. And it's something I've just heard a bit of with a few people this week that's quite common. And I think there's a similarity there. Would you agree about it's about giving ourselves permission for the both sides of it is normal and valid and necessary, right?
Yeah, and both sides, because one of the dangers with mental health is, we there's a danger you can become self-focused and think, I've always got to self-care, I've got to do everything for me. Um, and yeah, you need a bit of that, but actually you need to get out and
Yeah.
make a difference in the world and have purpose. And, we're talking about left and right brain. It's not that the left brain's bad. If you're going to go through your emails or do some work, left brain's brilliant at that. You don't want to answer all your emails in a right brain mode. Who knows what you do?
Mm.
It is about doing both, very much so.
There we go. All right, great. Next one is what is some of the worst advice you've received and why?
So this one, actually, it years ago when we were interviewing doctors for a new um, partnership in the practice, we very cruelly asked them one question, which was, "What's your philosophy on life?" And and about three of the candidates said, "Work hard, play hard." And I have to say, it just left me empty, really. I kind of knew where they were coming from, but actually, if your whole philosophy and purpose of life is to work hard and play hard, I'm not sure that's what I want to live by. It doesn't fill me with any joy or hope or excitement about life. So I just think actually life, yes, work is important, um, but I don't like that as a philosophy.
In the sense of it like almost being two extremes, like you've got to work really, really hard and then you can play hard, or what
I
is
think,
it in particular?
yeah, I think it's particularly the play hard, probably, because it implies that when you're not working, you should be pleasure seeking.
Got it.
And I think that bothers me. And think, gosh, if your life is only about working really hard, and also why are you working hard? You know,
Mm.
finding purpose um, is really, really worthwhile. I think it's probably the play hard. Life is not about seeking pleasure. We'll,
Yeah, we're getting there. We're getting there. Okay, we're nearly there, folks. I promise. All right, next one is the three life lessons questions. So this is about obviously the show is about helping people live happier, healthier, more fulfilling lives. Um, if you were to leave three truths to the world, three things that you would share to say, look, if you follow these three lessons, if you live by these three things, you're going to be on the right path. What would you say?
yeah. Oh gosh. Okay, I'm probably going to eat into my answer for the last one a little bit. Um, Well, there's some actual scientific evidence for this. There was the Harvard study. I think it actually was called the Harvard Study of Happiness, which is interesting, having said that happiness is not what
Yeah.
life's about. But where they tracked men initially who went to Harvard, and then they also combined it with men who grew up in Harlem, and then eventually they included women. But it's been running 70, 80 years. And the best, most strong predictor of living a fulfilled life and being happy with the life you've lived is having meaningful relationships.
Yeah.
So I would really invest your time in meaningful relationships. Um,
And just to be clear as well, I think it's really important to highlight you're not saying it has to be an intimate relationship with a
no,
partner. right? It's just meaningful relationships, which you can get
Yeah,
from all sorts of sources.
absolutely. And being in a toxic, intimate relationship is
Yeah.
actually has the opposite effect. Um, so I would say that I often say to people, so okay, two more about getting older. A lot of my patients, quite often when they're older, they say, "Don't get old, doctor." And I just say, "Don't grow up being someone that says that." The answer I've now started saying back, actually, in fact, since having someone very close to me die much younger than I wanted them to, is actually it's better than the alternative. You know, if you get old, it's a it's a gift to you, really. It's a privilege to get old. Try and grow old well and not complaining about what it's like to be old. Now, you can ask me in 30 years' time if I'm still here, whether I can still live that out. Um, but I often also say to my patients, they're getting older, if you can stay socially and physically active, those are really good ways of living, staying healthy, however long you live.
I love it. Absolutely brilliant. So, if people are hearing about you for the first time and they want to follow you, and of course, let's tell them about where they can get the book.
Yeah.
Do you want to just share where people can follow you and where they can get the book?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm on Instagram and TikTok, and I'm Doc Martin GP. So it's at Doc_Martin_GP on both Instagram and TikTok. And the book, Your Worry Makes Sense, it's coming out on 21st of March, and actually it's available for pre-order now on all online, or most online retailers. So you can order it now, or you can follow me on my channel. I haven't done a big reveal about the book. I haven't revealed the cover on the channel yet, but I'm going to probably in November time, and I'll be telling more about the book as it comes closer to being published.
Absolutely brilliant. And do go get that book, guys. All right, here we go. Dr. Martin, drum roll, please. The moment of truth. We've finally got there. What is your definition of success?
So my definition is to have built, well, to develop the ability to have loving relationships where you love and are loved, that make you secure enough that you then have the capacity to be kind to people who are not like you and people that you don't know. So if you basically, it's kindness and kindness to the other, because the biggest test of kindness is being kind to someone who's not like you and someone who's a stranger. If you can do that, you're going to be kind to the people that are like you and the people that you're close to. But I don't think you can really do that unless you've got the security and of who you are, and you've learned not to be happy all the time, but to be content in who you are. And the foundation for that is loving relationships.
Dr. Martin, thank you so much. Absolutely incredible. Thank you so much, mate.
Thank you for having me. It's been really fun chat.
All right, guys, you know the score. This is your opportunity now to get your questions in.
Do you see a correlation between people's physical and mental health?
A really good question.
Effective strategies for managing reoccurring thoughts around losing a loved one that's still with you, but you'll lose them someday.
The first thing is just to recognise that.
What are your thoughts on when you feel that the balance there between knowing whether I can continue doing this or whether I need something else to help me with this?
I would encourage you to go and